Good morning, everyone. If you're just joining us, we're just getting started here with our Webinar Wednesday Equitable Adaptation Planning edition. We'll just give it another minute or two. We have over 300 people registrants for this webinar, so we'll just give it a few minutes to see how many people trickle in. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nikki Caravelli. I'll be facilitating this Webinar Wednesday edition of Equitable Adaptation Planning. We'll just give it maybe another minute before we get started here. We have quite a few people registered to attend today. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and say that we can get started here and people can continue trickling in. So hello, everyone. Once again, if you're just joining us, my name is Nikki Caravelli. I am an assistant planner in climate resilience at the Office of Planning and Research. I'll be facilitating this webinar, Equitable Adaptation Planning, Practical Resources for California Communities. This is part of OPR's Webinar Wednesday series. My primary role over at OPR is supporting the Climate Resilience Department, particularly the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program, or ICARP for short. And as part of that, I manage the Adaptation Clearinghouse, which we'll be talking about shortly today. But I am here to introduce a number of exciting resources for you today and exciting speakers to introduce those resources. Should be a good one. Again, all focused on the subject of equity and equitable adaptation planning. Next slide, please. So just a few logistics here. We'll be using both the Q&A function and the chat function. If you have questions for any of the speakers, please use the Q&A function. If you have technical issues or feedback or want to share resources, please use the chat. We will not be moderating the chat for questions, only the Q&A module at the bottom of your screen. Next slide, please. So this is a quick look at our agenda for today. I'll kick it off giving just a brief introduction to the ICARP program, and then I'll kick it over to Kendall Skillicorn from the Office of Emergency Services to talk about the brand new shiny Adaptation Planning Guide 2020 version. And we'll also give you a virtual tour of the online version in its draft form that we're releasing on the Adaptation Clearinghouse pretty soon here. And then we'll follow that up with Sona Munok from the Greenlining Institute talking about her Making Equity Real guidebook, all about operationalizing equity in planning and policy. And then Tiffany Ganthier will present on the Georgetown Climate Center's Equitable Adaptation Legal and Policy Toolkit. All of these are some awesome state-of-the-art best practices resources that we're going to share with you today. I know that there are lots of resources out there, but we're just going to be focusing on these few resources for today. And then we'll wrap it up with a panel discussion, have some prepared questions and a chance for the audience to ask questions as well. Next slide, please. We can kick it off with an introduction to the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program, just for folks who haven't tuned into our activities before. The main mission of ICARP is to advance a climate resilient California for all. It was created by legislation in 2015, SB 246. So it has a statutory directive to drive a cohesive, coordinated response to climate change impacts across local, regional, and state efforts, and focusing particularly on equity and integrating mitigation with adaptation. The program has two main components, the Adaptation Clearinghouse and what's called the Technical Advisory Council. Next slide, please. So the State Adaptation Clearinghouse is a database of information and resources to assist decision makers at the state, regional, and local levels when planning for and implementing climate adaptation projects to promote resiliency across California. It's a searchable online database of case studies, tools of data, scientific studies, example plans and projects, and much more. And all of this can be filtered by climate impact or by sector, and a number of other different filters for exploring resources. Next slide, please. And the Technical Advisory Council brings together local government practitioners, scientists, and community leaders to help coordinate activities that better prepare California for the impacts of a changing climate. The council supports OPR in its goal to facilitate coordination among state, regional, and local adaptation and resiliency efforts, with a focus on opportunities to support local implementation actions that improve the quality of life for present and future generations. And we have a number of different sectors represented on the council. I think we have 23 or 24 council members, representatives from the private sector, state, local, and tribal governments, non-governmental organizations, environmental justice, etc. And the main charge of the council is to support OPR's goals to facilitate coordination among state, regional, and local agency efforts to adapt to climate change. Next slide, please. So in 2017, the council developed a vision statement that expresses the characteristics of a resilient California, as well as principles that guide how adaptation actions should be implemented to achieve this vision. And this vision is really meant to guide all local, regional, and state practitioners in what they're trying to achieve. And it begins with all Californians thrive in the face of a changing climate. And it's supported by 7 principles, which include, this is just a very brief summary. So if you want to read the full vision and full principles, please check it out on the OPR website. But the principles incorporate equity, natural infrastructure solutions, the concept of avoiding maladaptation, collaboration, using best available science and local and traditional knowledge, balancing short, mid, and long-term solutions, and utilizing an integrated, balanced, and multi-benefit approach. Next slide, please. So a key component to the council's passage of this vision and key to the ICARP overall charge was defining vulnerable communities in the context of climate change, since a large portion of the vision centers around addressing the needs of vulnerable communities. The council's definition of vulnerable communities provides clarity for our statewide partners on the underlying factors of community vulnerability and how these are exacerbated by climate impacts. This guide also includes a summary of existing statewide assessment tools that can be used to identify vulnerable communities, including a crosswalk with the indicators that are required elements of an SB 1000 environmental justice analysis. And there's also included in this guide additional indicators that could be used to assess underlying vulnerability on a case-by-case basis. And also included in the guide is a list of process guides that can serve to aid agencies undertaking efforts to define vulnerable communities. So this is a great resource that you can check out. It's available on the Office of Planning and Research website in the ICARP section of the site. And a little bit more about SB 1000. We hosted an SB 1000 guidance webinar about 2 months ago. That recording is available online. OPR has guidance now posted for SB 1000 also online. We won't be covering that today, but that resource is available to you. And also, I did not mention that this webinar will be recorded and sent out to anyone who registered. So just for your awareness. Okay, so that about wraps up the ICARP program. Let's move on to the next slide here. I would love to just check in with everyone who's joined us today and kind of get to know you all, and we can all kind of see together where we land on the adaptation planning spectrum. So I'm going to pull up the first poll here. So what is your experience with climate adaptation planning? None at all, beginner, moderate, or advanced? Looks like we're about 75% there. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and share the results. It looks like we have about 42% of us would categorize ourselves in the beginner category of adaptation planning, about a third of us as moderate, about 13% as advanced, and 12% absolutely no experience with climate adaptation planning. Okay, let's move on to the next poll. Are you familiar with either the 2012 or the 2020 California Adaptation Planning Guide? Go ahead and choose between no, yes, the old version, yes, the old and the new version, or yes, just the new version. And these questions kind of just give us a sense of your familiarity with these resources and the concepts we'll be talking about today. Okay, awesome. We're about 75% completion here, so I'll just share these results. So it looks like about 40% of folks on here have never heard of the Adaptation Planning Guide or aren't familiar with it, which is great. Boy, we can share a lot of great stuff with you today. And about 25% are familiar with both the old and the new version. And then 14% just the new version, 22% just the old version. Excellent. Really excited to share the updated version with you. And we have one final question for you today. Have you heard of and used the Adaptation Clearinghouse, the California Adaptation Clearinghouse? Awesome. Okay. Just about everyone who's been voting has come through. So it looks like almost 50% of folks on here have never used the State Adaptation Clearinghouse. That's also awesome because we get to show it to you today. A couple people, 25% have used it once or twice. A few fewer than that use it sometimes, and only about 5% of you use it frequently. Hopefully we can get most of you to somewhere in that middle range by the end of this webinar. Okay, so moving on here, go ahead and move to the next slide. Just want to provide a little bit of context for California adaptation planning and the requirements for local governments here. So there is statutory legislation, statutory requirement for local communities, that is cities and counties specifically in California, to plan for climate change. This comes in the form of SB 379 and SB 1035. If you haven't heard of these legislation and any guidance on this legislation, that's what this webinar is here for you today to learn about. We also have a more in-depth webinar that we hosted a couple months ago that was recorded specifically on SB 379 and some results of a survey that we did on SB 379 implementation in local communities. That information is recorded and available online. So this will be just a quick review, quick overview, but SB 379 passed in 2015 and it requires local governments to update their general plan safety elements to address climate vulnerability, adaptation, and resilience by 2022 for all cities and counties, and this does not include special districts. And the main trigger mechanism for this is around whether the jurisdiction already has a local hazard mitigation plan in place. If you do, starting in 2017, you are required to address this at the time of your next 5-year update. And if you don't have one, you must complete the requirement by 2022. And because local hazard mitigation plans are required by FEMA to update every 5 years, the message is that all local governments between 2017 and 2022 must address climate impacts in local planning. And then SB 1035 is a newer bill passed in 2018, which requires updates to specific hazards, including flood, fire, and climate every 8 years to make sure that climate sections are kept up to date in local planning. So what does this really mean for the local context? It means that local governments are required to prepare a climate change vulnerability assessment that identifies the risks that climate change poses to local jurisdictions and the geographic areas that are at risk from climate impacts, including but not limited to an assessment of how climate might affect the risks identified in the safety element. It also includes developing climate adaptation and resilience goals, policies, and objectives based on the finding of this vulnerability assessment, and then involves developing feasible implementation measures designed to carry out these goals, policies, and objectives. And jurisdictions must update their safety element as necessary to address climate adaptation and resiliency strategies, or update other planning documents and reference those within the general plan in order to meet the requirement of SB 379 and 1035. So that is the statutory requirement for climate planning in California, and which is why we have now this great guidance for you to show you exactly how communities can go about meeting this requirement and just generally meeting the challenge of climate change today. So next slide, please. Oh, yeah, we can skip past that. So now I am delighted to introduce to you Kendo Skillicorn, who is from the Office of Emergency Services, and she is the Division Chief of State Mitigation Planning, and she will be talking about the newly updated Adaptation Planning Guide.
Thank you, Nikki. So next slide, I believe. Great, thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this presentation to discuss the newly updated California Adaptation Planning Guide, otherwise known as the APG. My name is Kendall Skillicorn, and I am the Program Manager over the State Mitigation Planning Division with the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, or CalOES. One of our projects, major projects, is the California State Hazard Mitigation Plan, and that includes climate-related planning, which is why I'm here today. Next slide. So today I'll provide an introduction to the APG, an overview of the APG update process, and answer any questions that you may have. Next slide. Next slide. So the Adaptation Planning Guide helps city, county, tribal, and regional governments in addressing the unavoidable consequences of climate change by providing the latest adaptation resources and planning methodologies. The first guide was created in 2012 as a set of 4 complementary documents, and this new 2020 update is a single volume guide that will also be integrated online in the state's Adaptation Clearinghouse. Next slide. So the APG is designed to support local government, regional organizations, and climate collaborative groups to integrate best practices and current science into their adaptation planning efforts. Since 2012, there have been substantial developments in the climate adaptation space, resulting in more conclusive science, innovative adaptation practices and projects, and progressive climate legislation. Notably, this update of the APG provides an easy-to-follow, four-phase process for governments to develop their own adaptation and resilience strategies. Next slide. Okay. The APG incorporates findings from Safeguarding California Plan, the 2018 update, California's 4th climate change assessment, and other state climate documents. It also provides detailed information and steps on how to complete a vulnerability assessment and adaptation framework. Integrating equity into the climate adaptation planning process is critical. Moreover, many local governments lack guidance on how to do this, which is what we heard through the interagency working group and through the APG listening sessions that we held last summer. For the purposes of climate adaptation planning, equity means first identifying persons and frontline communities who may be the most vulnerable to climate change impacts like wildfires, sea level rise, heat, and precipitation changes. Second, it means ensuring that the planning process, distribution of resources, and efforts to address systematic wrongs are all conducted in an equitable manner. In the APG, we have a table taken from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, Guide to Equitable Community-Driven Climate Preparedness, which parses out the different dimensions of equity to incorporate procedural, distributional, and structural. Next slide. So now I'll provide a brief overview of the APG update process. Cal OES started the project in late 2018. We convened an interagency planning work group and consulted with stakeholders in various venues and formats. Our stakeholders included local agency staff that had used the 2012 APG in their adaptation planning processes, local staff that intended to prepare adaptation planning guides and or goals, the strategies, community-based organizations that led or support community adaptation planning processes, members of regional adaptation partnerships and collaboratives, local elected officials, and public and private partners to local governments. Cal OES, OPR, and our consultant team collaborated to identify stakeholder groups and organizations. OPR's Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resilience team was also an important collaborator and partner during the update of the APG. Next slide. A diverse interagency work group of 35 representatives helped advise on the content of the APG. It was critical to have their expertise in reviewing the topics and pointing the consultant team towards the resources. Next slide, please. So it had been 8 years since the last APG was published, and we recognized the need to integrate the newest state resources, updated climate science, and best practices. We also recognize all of the work that's being done at a local level and the need to not replicate what's already going on, but to support it. Additionally, we identified that many local governments are struggling with how to meet the requirements like SB 379 and SB 1035 that require local general plans, address climate change, adaptation, and resiliency. So we shared those options. Moreover, equity and outreach are in all phases of the document, which is key in any type of planning process. Lastly, we would like to let you know that this document will be fully integrated into the Adaptation Clearinghouse, which will be, I think, covered in the next presentation. Next slide. So the project team did an extensive review of the resources in the field. First, we looked at various ways that jurisdictions do vulnerability assessment and adaptation strategy development. Next, we looked at all of the resources that nonprofit organizations have created recently to guide adaptation processes on equity, outreach, and engagement. We also looked at how to incorporate assessments and costs, plan alignment and mainstreaming, funding options, and techniques to support implementation, monitoring, and evaluation, as well as addressing uncertainty. Next slide. These are a list of the resources that we looked into to integrate into the APG. As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of efforts going on statewide and locally. We wanted to make sure that the APG was capturing all of that information. Next slide. In the fall of 2018, Cal OES conducted a survey to its stakeholders on what were the uses of the APG in the past and what could be improved. Cal OES also did presentations to ICARP, the regional climate symposiums, and the interagency planning work group throughout 2019. We then conducted online listening sessions in the summer of 2019, as well as did a few stakeholder interviews. Once the public review draft was released in December 2019, the project team conducted a series of webinars to the general public to present the draft APG. The APG then went through another public review period. The draft public review period occurred from December 2019 to January 2020, and then our final draft public review period occurred in March 2020. After each review period, edits from stakeholders throughout the state at the local, regional, tribal, and state levels were incorporated into the APG. We wanted to make sure the guide incorporated the feedback and is reflective of what we had learned over the 2-year process. Next slide. Here's an overview of the schedule and the status of the APG. After outreach commenced in fall of 2018, the work products were a gap assessment memo and a recommendations memo from the consultant team. The consultant team then moved on to drafting the APG in the summer and fall of 2019. The public review draft APG was released in, like I said, in December 2019, followed by a revision period. The final public review draft APG was released in March 2020, followed by a second revision period in April and May to incorporate those changes. The final APG was released just in August 2020, and then after publicly releasing it, we're currently integrating the APG into the California Adaptation Clearinghouse. Next slide. Following our review of the literature and best practices and consultation with stakeholders, the project team identified a 4-phase adaptation planning process with outreach and engagement integrated into each phase. This is an overview of the 4 phases. We're not going to go into all the 4 phases because I don't have the time for that today, but you can check it out on our website. Within each phase is a series of steps, and we did our best to simplify this process compared to the last version of the APG. The APG also includes a set of definitions and 4 appendices, including sector summaries, an overview of the adaptation pathways approach, adaptation planning resources, and an example of local adaptation strategies by sector. Next slide. So that concludes the presentation. I don't know if we're doing questions now or if we're doing them at the end.
Yeah, we can go ahead and do a quick round of just clarifying questions specific to the adaptation planning guide. So go ahead and type into the Q&A box if you have any questions for Kendall. I'll just give you a minute to type those in there. And we did have an earlier question from Gilly about the SB 379 requirements. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. So Gilly asked, if we have an annex in a county-wide local hazard mitigation plan, do we update the annex with adaptation, or do we have to adopt a separate local hazard mitigation plan by 2022 with adaptation included? And my understanding is that you would not need to adopt a separate local hazard mitigation plan. You do have a couple of different options for meeting SB 379. I believe that updating the annex likely would suffice. You could also choose to update the safety element itself. And you could also create a separate climate adaptation or action plan. There's a number of different avenues that you can take, so long as whatever update avenue that you choose is referenced within the safety element. So you do have to update the safety element to reference the annex or separate planning document or whatever avenue that you choose. And OPR's Planning and Community Development Program Manager, Eric Daycock, is a much more in-depth expert on this than I am, and I would encourage you to reach out to him. I'll put his information in the Q&A in just a second here. And if anyone else on the panel has additional answers to that question, feel free.
No, I was just going to add that at Cal OES, we do have a division that is the Local Hazard Mitigation Division. And so Victoria Lamar Haas is our division chief on that side. And she can absolutely answer any further questions on local hazard mitigation plans that you may have. I can send that information out.
Awesome. Okay, let's see. We have quite a few different questions coming out here. Okay. So Emily asks, some folks will be doing greenhouse gas mitigation planning at the same time as climate adaptation and resiliency planning. Does this guide provide guidance on integrating these processes?
So, sorry, rereading the question.
Sorry, I meant to say Kendall. This question is for you.
So yeah, sorry. So this does mainly focus on the adaptation side of the house as opposed to mitigation. So it doesn't go into greenhouse gases as much.
I think
Sorry,
there
I know
are, yeah,
there are,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Sorry.
I think there are a few sections that cover integrating adaptation and mitigation, but unfortunately the state doesn't have in-depth mitigation planning guidance. There is some in our general plan guidelines, which is available on the OPR website. Let's see, what other questions do we have coming in here? Okay. So Gail is asking a question about, the connection between lightning storms and recent wildfires, and the connection to addressing wildfires with prison labor. And I don't believe our guide really gets into the complexity of those types of issues. I think that's a statewide question that we're all kind of grappling with, but I don't know if anyone else on the panel has thoughts on that.
This guide specifically doesn't go into it, but I definitely think that we are going to be looking at this in our state hazard mitigation plan. And I'm sure other local mitigation plans are starting to look at this as well. But the APG does not go into that.
And then Maureen asks, this is another question for you, Kendall, is there an executive summary that is a tool that more clearly communicates this work and planning process to the general public to help with education and outreach?
Not quite yet. We are working on that so that it's just an easy one-sheeter. We just got the approval a couple weeks ago, so that should be going live fairly soon on our website, which will be on the last slide. So we'll try to get that out to everyone as soon as possible.
Awesome. And just for your awareness, everyone on the webinar, I'll be talking a little bit on our work to integrate the guide into an online interactive version. And hopefully the online version will also serve as a helpful education and outreach tool. I'll give you a tour in just a minute. Lisa asked, is there a listing of available localities needing a plan update? Unfortunately, we don't have one at OPR. We are trying to track how many folks are updating their planning and who has done it already, but we just don't have a fully updated list of that. Kendall, I'm not sure if OES tracks that.
Internally, I think we do. I don't know if there's anything that goes externally, but internally we do track who has current plans or expired and all of that. But I don't know if it's tracked whether or not they discuss or that they've met the Senate bill legislation as it's required to climate planning. So I don't know if we track that as specifically. I'd have to find out.
Yeah, on the Adaptation Clearinghouse, we do try to keep that updated with everyone who has updated their adaptation plans. It's not comprehensive. We're still looking for additional examples, but yeah, I'm not aware of any list of everyone who still needs to complete the update. So let's see here, next question. Gail asks, does the guide offer communities advice on developing green microgrids as part of becoming more resilient?
So in one of the appendices, the APG does offer some strategies, adaptation strategies that local communities are currently doing. So there are a couple of strategies in there, incorporated in there, and I think a couple do address microgrids.
Okay. And then I'm gonna just use this I'm gonna take one last question from David. Has there been any evaluation of local level adaptation plans for consistency with the state guidance? And I can take a stab at that. So OPR did in SB 379 survey over the last year to assess how folks are meeting the SB 379 requirement, and we presented the results of that on a webinar a couple months ago. The recording is available online, and I apologize, I don't have the numbers or the findings of that report right in front of me, but that resource is available online and we can share it after the webinar. So with that, I want to make sure that we have enough time to get to the rest of our lovely panel here today. So we're going to move on, but at the last half hour of our webinar, we'll have a chance to ask everyone more questions. So thank you everyone for your thoughtful questions and engagement here. Okay, so this next section, which I'm excited to present to you, is about how we are integrating the planning guide with the Clearinghouse. So during the whole update process of the Adaptation Planning Guide, the Office of Emergency Services and Office of Planning and Research have developed a vision for turning this into an interactive version to make it much easier for readers to really process and take advantage of the multitude of information and resources in both in the guide and in the Adaptation Clearinghouse, and to make a really clear roadmap for folks to follow. With linkages to all of the different resources and tools and search capabilities that are available on the Adaptation Clearinghouse. Next slide, please. So our vision for doing this, for turning the Adaptation Planning Guide into an interactive online version, is to make it accessible, searchable, easily navigable, interactive, as well as include practical downloadable checklists and templates to really connect the guidance to resources that you can take and run for your local adaptation planning process. Next slide, please. So our process for this was we took the updated adaptation planning guide this summer and scoped and designed the vision over the last few months and turned it into a draft online site, which I'll be giving a tour of in just a second here. We're now in the public feedback phase of this process. And so all throughout September, we're going to be hosting workshops and surveys to get all of your feedback on how we've done with turning this resource into an online environment. And then in November, we'll update and publish the full version on the Adaptation Clearinghouse. Next slide, please. So just a little bit more about our public process. Today, this is our introductory webinar introducing the Adaptation Planning Guide to you all. You can also sign up for more in-depth regional workshops where we'll really dive into the online version, as well as feature a few region-specific resources and do a more in-depth workshop type style feedback process. There's also online surveys that we're using, and you can register to participate in all of this on this link here, which we'll share after the webinar. Next slide, please. This is just a quick snapshot of all of the dates that we are hosting a regional workshop at. So you can sign up for the one that is in your region. If you can't make the one that's in your region, you're welcome to attend a different one, but we really encourage folks to sign up for the one in their region just because they will be slightly tailored more to the unique needs and climate impacts facing each region. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm gonna just give you all a tour of the new online version and help orient you to this resource in the hopes that you will dig more deeply into it on your own time and or sign up for a regional workshop to give us feedback. Make sure that this resource is really as useful to you as possible. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, hold on. Give me just a second here. Okay. So you should be able to see the Adaptation Clearinghouse now. Let me know if you can't on my screen. So for those of you that have seen the Adaptation Clearinghouse, you'll notice that this is our draft site, right? It's not live yet. You can view it live, but the actual Adaptation Clearinghouse is available on its regular resilientca.org link. And so this site is really designed for you to explore and provide feedback on, and then we'll update it based on that feedback. But you'll notice right away that we've made a few design changes to kind of simplify and clarify and update and modernize the Adaptation Clearinghouse. Right off the bat, we have the main site search. That's the main point of this clearinghouse. There's also now a button for submitting resources up at the top. And just to and then you can check out what is most popular. So to dive into the Adaptation Planning Guide, you can do that from the top navigation bar and right away see that there are many different components to the guide to jump into right away. You can go to the homepage or the introduction if you're just getting started, or if you already know that you need a template or toolkit for vulnerability, you can jump right into phase 2. There's also these supporting resources. This page, state adaptation efforts, will be dedicated to connecting all of the different, statewide efforts that are going on to coordinate adaptation across the statewide level. There's also these resources from the appendices of the Adaptation Planning Guide. So examples of local adaptation strategies and whatnot that you can access here. So I'm just going to the home page. So here again, you can see all of that same content and jump into the content based on where you are in the planning process. So say I'm brand new to adaptation planning, where would I go first? I would probably want to read the introduction. You can also download the Adaptation Planning Guide here. And it sounds like my internet might be a little bit laggy, so I'll just pause a little bit to make sure everyone's with me. Okay, so jumping into the introduction. So here in the introduction, you can explore what is the purpose of the Adaptation Planning Guide, how to use the guide, an overview of statewide climate adaptation and what adaptation planning is, as well as important considerations before starting, such as equity and community engagement. And you can also download the introduction chapter here. So I'm not going to go through each of these separately, but just to give you a quick snapshot of what the phase content looks like. You can view each phase by step, as well as download the templates that are unique to each chapter. You can download the chapter itself. And each phase has links and resources and ways to expand more based on the level of content that you want to read, the level of depth that you want to dig into this guidance. So I want to show you a couple of other things here. So going back to the home page, looking at the top navigation, the clearinghouse, in addition to having the Adaptation Planning Guide featured here, features also case studies and tools and data and resources organized by topic. So say you work in the agricultural sector. First of all, if you are really interested in equity and environmental justice resources, you can click on the topic relevant to that here. Let's go and take a look at that. Okay. So here, this page gives a brief overview of climate vulnerability and equity and environmental justice. And at the bottom, you can search all of the clearinghouse resources that are dedicated to equity and environmental justice. These are pre-filtered to make sure that that subject is addressed in the resources that you're seeing here. If you wanted to dig into a specific sector, you can click on all adaptation topics. And these are the topics that align with the state's adaptation strategy. So just jumping into the agricultural sector. Again, if you scroll down this page, you can explore all resources filtered already for relevance to agriculture. Featured state resources. You can also now see climate impacts and vulnerabilities specific to that sector. So this is all taken from the Adaptation Planning Guide. And then example adaptation strategies as well are viewable on this page. One other thing that I want to show you, going back up to the main navigation, we have a new feature for comparing tools and data and projection resources that are out there. So if you click on featured tools once you're up here, it'll take you to our featured tools comparison page. And apologies if I'm moving faster than the internet, but hopefully you're all following along here with me. So this page, we understand that there's a lot of tools and data out there, a lot of science to sift through when you're trying to figure out, well, what do I need just for my community? So we tried to make this tool help you compare what might be most helpful for you. So at the top, you can filter based on the climate impacts that might be relevant for your community. Maybe you're on the coast, you want to take a look at sea level rise, and you want to look at how that impacts your community. You can filter by the sectors that are relevant for you, or just the broader categories of land use and community development. And then the page will populate only the tools that are relevant to those categories that you're selected, or you can download the list of all of the tools. And the information here is meant to show you exactly what you're getting from each tool. So you can see if it has observed data as well as projections, whether it's much more technical or if it's an easier tool to use, whether you don't need technical background to use it, and whether the data is downloadable. So this is just a quick tour of the online adaptation planning guide and the updates to the State Adaptation Clearinghouse. I hope that you find it interesting and want to dive in and explore more and see how these resources might be useful to you. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing. We'll see if you want to pull back up your slides. Okay. And then next slide, please. I would just love to hear what all of your reactions are to seeing this tour. What is your first reaction? Does it seem useful? Do you have any immediate feedback like, wow, it's confusing, or wow, it's amazing? What resources or guidance sections are you most excited to explore? Go ahead and just type that into the chat and let's see how everyone is reacting. Awesome, seeing some kudos pop in here. Great, lots of kudos coming in. Okay. I'm not going to answer, so I know that we have quite a few more questions that are popping up here in the Q&A. I'm not going to get to those right now. I want to make sure that we can have our presenters speak on their tools and resources. Feel free to keep typing in reactions and questions as we go here, but I would like to just move right along. So without further ado, we can go to the next slide here. Oh yeah, this is just a recap. So ways that you can engage in this whole process. One, download the Adaptation Planning Guide, available on the Office of Emergency Services website, as well as on the site that I just showed you. Two, register for a workshop or event to dig more deeply into the resources and help us make sure this resource is useful to you. And three, feel free to explore and complete the surveys. Okay, and I'll share the survey in a minute here, but I'm gonna just turn the presentation over to my colleague Sona, and she's going to be talking about the Greenlining Institute's Making Equity Real Guidebook. I'm really excited to learn more about this resource, so Sona, take it away.
Thanks so much, Nikki, and good morning, everyone. My name is Sona Monat, and I'm a senior policy analyst at the Greenlining Institute. And for those who don't know, we are a racial and economic justice public policy organization. We're based in Oakland, California, but we do statewide advocacy. We work on a wide range of policy issues to help address the harmful impacts that redlining policies created in low-income communities of color. And so the presentation today is on a report that we published last fall on how to make equity real in adaptation and resilience efforts. And we titled this report Making Equity Real because equity is a pretty popular buzzword these days, which is great. And we're really happy to see that it's gaining a lot of momentum and it's on everyone's radar. But at the same time, as it becomes more and more mainstream, there's a real risk that equity can turn into an empty promise if there's no strategy on how do we actually make equity real and operationalize it. Because for us, we want to make sure that equity is not just a commitment, but an ongoing practice. And so today, I'm excited to share our framework that we've been developing on how to make equity real in climate adaptation and resilience efforts. And this framework can serve as a tool to support equitable climate adaptation and resilience planning. Next slide. So here's a quick overview of the presentation. First, just wanted to ground us into why equity matters in this field. Then I'll share the framework, and then I'll offer some quick examples of how the framework can be applied in policy work. Thank you. And just quick outcome, hoping that you'll all have by the end of this presentation, really just here to share information about the guidebook, and hopefully this can be helpful in whatever sort of adaptation work you're all doing. Next slide, please. So before diving into the report, I just want to ground us in the values with which Greenlining and probably many others who are listening in are working with. So this image on the left is from our partners at the California Environmental Justice Alliance, and it's part of their work on the Transformative Climate Communities program. And it gives us one picture of what resilient communities can look like. And achieving this vision on the left, it requires a lot of things. We have to strengthen built infrastructure, protect natural resources and the natural environment around us. Importantly, we have to make sure that we're centering communities, especially those who have been on the front lines of the climate crisis, who have been historically overburdened by the extractive fossil fuel economy and will be most impacted by future disasters. And we have to consider that there's like short-term strategies and long-term strategies here. And in the short term, it means preparing neighborhoods and people to cope with and respond to this new climate reality. And if we're all in California, we're going through extreme heat in addition to wildfires. So there's multiple crises that we have to address in the short term. But in the long term, it's important to consider how are we fundamentally changing power dynamics and addressing underlying systemic inequities that continue to oppress low-income communities of color? So really wanting us to be mindful of those two kind of outcomes that we'd like to see. And I wanted to start with this vision because this presentation outlines some strategies towards achieving it. Next slide, please. So for over the last 2 decades, Greenlining's been working to advance racial equity for communities of color and low-income communities. And one of the policy areas that we focus on is environmental equity, because race, even more than class, is the #1 indicator for where toxic and polluting facilities are located today. These facilities are predominantly located in low-income communities of color, and as a result, our communities face numerous environmental injustices in addition to other socioeconomic challenges. And since climate change exacerbates all of these threats, communities of color are often hit hardest by climate change and have the least resources to adapt. But as we know, these injustices did not just show up today. They're the result of generations of discriminatory policies that have created a lot of economic and environmental burdens in communities of color. Next slide, please. And so just to give a little bit of context and history, the location of Black and Brown communities near sources of pollution comes from discriminatory government policy from the 1930s, which we know as redlining. And in the 1930s, in the middle of the Great Depression, many families were struggling to make ends meet and were defaulting on their mortgages. And so in response, federal housing agencies began providing government-backed mortgages to help families build wealth through the Depression. However, not all families received help. To figure out how to distribute the mortgages, governments worked with bankers and realtors to create maps to identify which neighborhoods to invest in based on credit risk. And Oakland was one of those neighborhoods, and that's it's a map of the East Bay communities on the left here. And they created a grading system based on several different factors like quality of housing, but the primary indicator of risk was race. And neighborhoods are graded based on a color code that you can see on the map on the left. So green meant best, blue meant still desirable, yellow meant definitely declining, and red meant hazardous. And areas that were redlined were seen as a credit risk because of the presence of people of color. And this is where the term redlining comes from. Next slide, please. And so, for example, I wanted to just show an audit from surveyors for the city of Oakland, and this was from 1937. And you can see I've highlighted in red, it was really common to see racist and offensive language like infiltration of Negroes and Orientals listed as a detrimental influence in the neighborhood, and the reason that this area had a grade of red. And to really illustrate how egregious the policy was, the government had a manual that literally said incompatible racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities. And so between 1932 and 1962, when redlining policies were continuing to happen, the federal government backed over $120 billion of loans, but more than 98% of that went to white people. And so at a time when white Americans were building wealth to fund their children's education, start businesses, and buy a home, people of color, especially Black people, were shut out from these opportunities. And it's led to the extreme wealth inequality that we see today. And this lack of investment in communities of color redlining didn't just impact economic conditions. As people of color were locked into crowded inner city areas, these communities were also selected as a place to site polluting facilities. Next slide, please. So highways were also used as a way to separate Black neighborhoods from white ones, and were often constructed directly through communities of color, exposing them to serious transportation pollution and negative health impacts. And in California, a 2018 analysis done by the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, or OEHA, shows that 89% of people in the poorest, most polluted, disadvantaged communities are people of color. And so this image on the slide you're seeing here compares the East Bay redlining map with a current map of CalEnviroScreen. And it's of the same area of East Bay communities. And the CalEnviroScreen map identifies areas that are most impacted by pollution and socioeconomic conditions. And you can see that the red and orange communities on the right that suffer the most from poverty and pollution are the same communities that were redlined over 80 years ago. And while redlining is one government policy that created inequities along race lines in communities, it's not the only one. Next slide. And you'll have to click a couple of times for all the images to show up. Thank you. So yeah, since the founding of this country, on the genocide of Native people, to slavery, to Jim Crow laws, to the Chinese Exclusion Act, to Japanese internment, to ICE detention centers, race has always determined the winners and losers in America. Centuries of racist and discriminatory policies have essentially put handcuffs on Black and Brown communities from being able to accumulate wealth, power, and resources. And it's important to remember that this history wasn't created by just a few bad actors. These were all deliberate public policy decisions that were carried out by federal, state, and local government institutions. And so while government created these injustices, government can also play an important role in addressing them. And this is the message that we want our policymakers to hear and to understand, that as we move forward and develop new policies, we have to acknowledge that race-based policies were created and continue to perpetuate the inequities we see today. Next slide. And what we see today is that the cumulative effect of redlining and numerous other discriminatory policies have resulted in segregation, disinvestment, poverty, and pollution in neighborhoods of color. And all of this has led to a climate gap, where poor people and people of color are disproportionately and unequally impacted by climate change and have the least resources to adapt. And this is what these headlines illustrate here. For instance, communities may lack the resources that can be so critical during climate disasters, like having access to a car or living near safe transit options to escape a climate event, or having enough savings in case you're displaced, experiencing unemployment, or need medical attention. And so as we're thinking about creating climate adaptation policies and plans, it's critical that we center equity to protect our most impacted communities from climate disasters. Next slide. And can you also click a couple of times here, please? And so to center equity in climate adaptation and resilience, we'll need strategies that provide comprehensive multiple benefits to impacted communities. Because as we saw, climate disasters don't just impact the natural environment where people live, but can exacerbate any existing health, environmental, and socioeconomic inequities. And so the strategies that we need are ones that provide multiple benefits. We want strategies that build the resilience of physical environments, that create better health outcomes in communities, that enhance economic opportunity, reduce exposure to pollutants, and continuously engage and empower communities throughout every phase of planning to implementation. And so now I'd like to share how our Making Equity Real framework can intentionally and meaningfully center equity in adaptation and resilience efforts. Next slide. And you can skip this slide, please. So if there's one thing about this presentation that I'd like everyone to walk away with, it's these 4 steps. And this is our Making Equity Real framework. For any climate adaptation and resilience policy or effort, equity has to be embedded first in the goals, vision, values, second in any processes, third in the implementation, and fourth in the analysis. And I'm gonna walk us through each of these 4 steps. But for now, what I wanted to share is that equity has to show up in all 4 categories to create the strongest outcomes for communities. And we have to be explicit about it, because again, we want equity to not just be a commitment, but an ongoing practice. And so I'll go into each step right now. Next slide, please. So for the first step, for goals, equity can't just be a talking point. If an adaptation effort is serious about creating equitable outcomes, it has to make that explicit in the goals of an effort. And a good example is the Los Angeles Countywide Sustainability Plan. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but this plan outlines what local government and stakeholders can do to improve the well-being of communities in the county while reducing damage to the natural environment and adapting to the changing climate. And this plan is organized around 12 different goals that provide a shared vision for a sustainable LA County. And I use this plan as an example because equity is not one of the 12 goals, but it's built into almost all of the 12 goals. And that's what we want to see. By weaving equity into all the sustainability goals, the county will be able to tackle multiple existing inequities that communities face. And I have some examples on the slide about how the goals reflect equity, but definitely encourage folks to check out the entire plan to learn more. But on the slide I have, for instance, goal 1, is to have resilient and healthy community environments where residents thrive in place. And the goal explicitly says that the county will protect low-income communities and communities of color from pollution and reduce health and economic inequities. Similarly, goal number 3 talks about equitable and sustainable land use and development without displacement, which is another important equity consideration. And the last example I'll share is goal 8, which talks about creating a more safe, reliable, and affordable transportation system, and specifically considering residents with limited mobility options that can impact access to different economic opportunities. And so just to reiterate, we really like this example because equity should not be siloed into one goal, but should really show up in all the goals. because our communities require multifaceted intersectional strategies to build resilience. Because if a community is protected from flooding, but is still under threat of displacement, then it's not truly resilient. Next slide, please. And so in the second step, equity has to be built into any processes of an effort to ensure communities have opportunities to influence and drive decisions. And the example I wanted to share here is an equity-centered process for LA County's Measure A, which passed in 2016, and aims to provide safe, clean neighborhood parks and beaches for the county. And as part of the process, the County Board of Supervisors, they approved a countywide comprehensive parks and recreation needs assessment to identify park need in the county. And the map on the screen here shows each area's park need, with green being very low and red being very high. And this entire process involved significant resident engagement, and it included workshops for almost 180 study areas where residents could learn about their area's parks and create a list of projects and to prioritize them. And the workshop and outreach materials were also available in multiple languages to make it accessible to residents who didn't speak English. And so the data from this assessment can now be used to equitably allocate funds in high park need areas, while also addressing the specific needs of each community that came up through the workshops. Next slide, please. And then the third step is ensuring that the implementation of a adaptation policy or plan actually leads to equitable outcomes. And this fundamentally requires understanding the community identified needs and developing implementation strategies that respond to those needs to build resilience. And the example I wanted to share is of an effort that's centered around community needs to inform and drive implementation. So an organization, the People Organizing to Demand Environmental and Economic Rights, PODER, they're a Latinx space building environmental justice organization in San Francisco, and they collaborated with the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission in a project. So PODER created a new community farm on SFPUC owned land, and they converted a 5-acre area that was next to a park into an urban community farm. And the farm provides space for community members to come together to grow their own food and medicine. And the park and the farm are important resilience assets in the community. So community members created a survey and essentially went door to door to ask residents about their priorities, concerns, and ideas for building resilience that the farm and the park can help with. And the community members collected all of this data and came up with different resilience strategies that were informed and developed by residents in the community, including a lot of youth. And throughout this project, residents were able to increase their capacity to participate in resilience planning and implementation. And they were also, of course, able to create resilience strategies that met community needs in a very culturally relevant way. Next slide, please. And so analysis of an effort is the last step, and this involves regularly evaluating the equity progress in an effort to continuously improve the equity outcomes. And this was also the hardest step to find examples for. In our report, we reviewed over 40 different policies and programs, and an equity analysis was missing in almost all of them. However, what we're seeing around different states in the country, as well as different cities, different jurisdictions are establishing offices of racial equity. The state of Washington has one, and San Francisco established an office last summer as well. And in the San Francisco Office of Racial Equity, the office is tasked with creating a citywide racial equity plan that outlines strategies to address racial disparities in San Francisco. And each city department would have to adopt an action plan that states, how they plan to address the inequities and how they plan to measure progress. And so new types of analysis tools will be created to assess these outcomes. And so we'll still have to wait to see how things get implemented through this office. But I think it's worth keeping on our radar just to see how they develop tools to assess equity outcomes and whether that analysis can be replicated elsewhere. And if anyone has any examples or models of equity evaluations, I think that is a huge gap in the field. And so I would be very curious to learn about any examples that others might have. Next slide, please. And so that was the last step. I know it was a lot of information, but just to quickly summarize, the main takeaway here is that whatever adaptation effort is being developed, these 4 steps can serve as a roadmap to creating really meaningful equity outcomes. And while I only went through a few examples here, the report we just published provides a lot more examples and best practices for how to center equity in different adaptation and resilience efforts in each of these 4 categories: goals, process, implementation, and analysis. Next slide, please. And here, I just have a link to the report if you'd like to read it in more detail, as well as my contact information. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions that I don't get a chance to answer today. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sona, for that wonderful presentation, getting lots of kudos here in the Q&A and in the chat. We did have one question. Do you have this folks are just so enamored, they want this presentation in a separate format. Do you have recordings of this presentation on the Greenlining Institute, or that you can share with webinar participants in case they just want to share this portion of the webinar?
I will have to check and just see if we do have a recording available. So I can get back to you, Nikki, on that.
Okay, no worries. And just for everyone's knowledge, this entire webinar is being recorded, and all of the slides and the recording will be shared with all registrants after the webinar. And let's see here. We have one more question here from Eric for you, Sona, and then we'll dive into Tiffany's presentation. Is jobs and employment included in the equity goals?
Yes, from Greenlining's perspective, jobs and employment should absolutely be included in any sort of multi-benefit strategy that we're thinking about. From our perspective, we want our communities to be living in very environmentally safe and healthy communities, but we also want to make sure that they're economically thriving and have resources to adapt to different climate disasters. And so jobs and employment are an integral part of our theory on how to create the most equitable outcomes in communities. So yes, short answer is yes, and the report goes into more details about that. And of course, happy to touch base offline to discuss more.
Awesome. Thanks, Sona. There's lots of questions here that folks have, but in the interest of time, I want to get to Tiffany's presentation here. So thank you for that, and I think we can move on to the next slide here. Okay, so Tiffany Ganthier is joining us from the Georgetown Climate Center to present on her Equitable Adaptation Legal and Policy Toolkit. So without further ado, Tiffany, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. So my name is Tiffany Ganthier, and I'm an Institute Associate with the Georgetown Climate Center. Next slide. So just to tell you a little bit about GCC, which is what we call Georgetown Climate Center. So since 2009, the Georgetown Climate Center has served as a resource to federal, state, and local governments all around the country, working to reduce emissions that cause climate change, and also taking steps to make their communities more resilient as they adapt to the impacts of climate change that are already happening. So we're based at Georgetown Law Center, so here in Washington, DC. Next slide. So why has GCC started to dive into equitable adaptation? So with the changes we are seeing driven by climate change all around the country, it's important to acknowledge that climate impacts especially affect those that are already suffering from cumulative burdens of pollution, racism, political, and economic marginalization. So marginalization in turn creates frontline communities, and as you heard from Sona, frontline communities are those that are experiencing the first and worst consequences of climate change. And frontline communities are most often communities of color and low-income communities. So this subject is more relevant and more urgent than ever right now. So even as the effects of climate change are clearly more obvious and more urgent, the consequences of the country's history of racism and discrimination are also in the forefront of our minds and a focus of the national dialogue. So the Equitable Adaptation Toolkit builds on GCC's earlier work on urban heat, green infrastructure, and sea level rise to produce a resource for best and emerging practices in adaptation planning. So we too have an Adaptation Clearinghouse, which is our database of thousands of resources on climate adaptation. And it's very, I guess you would say, similar to California's, except that ours is featuring case studies from all around the country. So we've been populating this clearinghouse since 2009. So as you can imagine, there are plenty and all over different subjects. So we actually have an equity portal that houses all of the equity related resources in our clearinghouse. And those are the ones that have a strong equity angle. And we also have on the ground work with communities, like our work in DC to implement the district's climate ready plan and other on the ground projects that we've been using to kind of learn from and develop this equity toolkit. So we sought to accomplish, and what we sought to accomplish in compiling this toolkit is to both define what it means to take an equity-centered approach to prepare frontline communities for the realities of climate change, and provide examples through our case studies of how states and local planning officials have implemented the legal and policy tools to achieve equitable outcomes. Next slide. So I am the project manager and the lead author of the toolkit, but the GCC team and a few other authors that we've been partnering with have been tackling these subjects for the past 2 years to ultimately create this body of work. So I wanted to share the other authors on this slide here. So they are the go-to experts for each individual subject. So I was able to outline the subjects that we were deciding to tackle, and these are the authors that wrote each chapter. Next slide. So what's in the Equitable Adaptation Legal and Policy Toolkit? So the toolkit is intended to aid local governments and community-based organizations nationwide that are focusing on or centering equity in their climate adaptation initiatives. The toolkit explores practices and case studies from a wide variety of cities and draws lessons from those different approaches. It also provides frameworks to help people tailor legal and policy options for their own jurisdictions that advance equitable responses to the impacts of climate change. So I'm now going to walk you through the toolkit very briefly, but it is live on the website, on the GCC website right now. And I encourage you all to explore it yourselves after today's presentation, because as you can see, there are lots of different subject areas and several hundred case studies to dive into. Next slide. So overall, for purposes of this toolkit, we've decided that equity is defined as an approach based in fairness, designed to ensure that everyone has access to the same opportunities and resources. So in the climate context, to truly be resilient, communities must have the resources to prepare for the changes that are already being seen on the ground. They also need to increase their capacity to withstand impacts and recover quickly after extreme weather events that will happen with greater frequency and intensity from a changing climate. So in practice, building equity into climate resilience planning and implementation involves not just addressing the disproportionate impacts that affect frontline communities, but also working to dismantle barriers that have prevented frontline communities from thriving, which was a lot of what Sona was explaining. So that's why this toolkit focuses first on delivering diverse and inclusive engagement processes. So how planning and implementation decisions get made and who has a voice in those processes. So we call that procedural equity. So that's the second, or I guess the first overall chapter or section of the toolkit. The second big focus of the toolkit is the substantive equitable outcomes. So in other words, actually implementing policy solutions and programs that seek to more fairly distribute access to the benefits of those programs and investments, and seek to remedy historic underinvestment in frontline communities. And finally, in the financing and funding tools section, we provide detailed information about the practical legal and policy options decision makers and communities have for ensuring that those resources reach the communities that need them the most. So to go into a little bit more detail of each section now, next slide. So the procedural equity section contains 3 chapters that explore tools that can be used to achieve procedural equity when addressing climate adaptation solutions. And that is the community engagement and social cohesion chapter, governance and budgeting chapter, and data metrics and monitoring chapter. Next slide. The Equitable Adaptation Solutions chapters, there are 7 chapters here, and these explore equitable outcomes under certain climate adaptation subject areas. So those chapters include the Economic Resilience chapter, which includes jobs and workforce development, as someone had a question about, the Resilient Water chapter, natural resilience and green space access, resilient energy and utility industry measures, resilient affordable housing and anti-gentrification and displacement, disaster preparedness, responsive recovery, and public health. Next slide. So to dive into one of the procedural equity chapters, one of those chapters is the community engagement process. So this chapter, the community engagement chapter, is located in the procedural equity section of the toolkit, and it highlights procedural equity principles and action items on how to effectively engage the community in adaptation processes. The chapter explores a number of procedural equity principles that should inform decision-making and a number of discrete tasks that ensure that community engagement mechanisms are included in adaptation processes. So for those who are looking for examples and guidance on how to engage the community effectively, this would be the chapter that you would go to. So this chapter also provides resources and case studies of these examples in action. One of those examples, next slide, is the community-driven resilience and planning framework. Also, as you can see here, we have the guidebook that Sona just presented on, also featured in this section. So this framework that we're discussing can be found in the subchapter titled Utilizing General Frameworks and Guidance. This resource was informed by community-based organizations from across the country, and this report outlines a framework to meaningfully engage vulnerable and impacted communities in defining and building climate resilience. Next slide. So for the subject-specific chapters in the third piece of the toolkit, here's an example of one, but they're all structured in a very similar way. So you have the chapter, so that's the Equitable Disaster Preparedness, Response, and Recovery chapter. And there's 4 to 5 legal and policy tools. So for this chapter, there's a planning tool section, equitable opportunities for relocation and response to disaster, supporting the development of resilience hubs, equitable recovery tools, and funding tools. So outside of the 4 to 5 legal and policy tools, each of these tools explores the economic, equity, environmental, legal, and administrative considerations of the tool. And then there's also a lesson learned section for each tool, followed by 2 to 4 case studies or resources representing best emerging practices and displaying the implementation of each tool. So for example, this chapter here, I would say that the planning tool section is where a lot of you on this webinar would probably want to go first. The planning tool section explores creating proactive disaster preparedness plans with input from the community to help mitigate at least some adverse consequences. The scale and scope of planning tools or resources can vary at the state or regional or community specific levels, but you'll get examples of all of those. Next slide. So one of those examples in thinking about disaster planning tools, I chose a California example, and that's the San Diego County Emergency Operations Plan, specifically the Annex Q on evacuation. It's been highlighted by several experts as a shining example of planning for all that, and that lessons can be drawn from and learned from. So that's why we decided to include it. So the objectives covered in this evacuation plan that make it a good learning opportunity is that they're providing for evacuation to appropriate transportation points, evacuation points, and shelters, providing adequate means of transportation for individuals with disabilities and others with access and functional needs, providing for the procurement, allocation, and use of necessary transportation and law enforcement, account for the needs of individuals with household pets and service animals prior to, during, and following a major disaster or emergency, and providing initial notification, ongoing reentry communications to the public through joint information centers. And they assure the safe reentry of the evacuated persons. A lot of these are not often thought about in many evacuation plans. So this was a shining example that those key examples were pulled out of that we hope other jurisdictions can learn from and implement in their own cities or counties. So all in all, like I said, there are several hundred case studies, and we hope that these examples and other case studies featured in the toolkit will be helpful. But of course, we understand that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to equitable adaptation solutions because no two communities are the same. So our hope is that the toolkit will provide important background and make it easier for decision makers in the communities that they serve to have these conversations and plan together for the benefit of all. We're also really excited to share again that, you know, there are over 100 case studies included in the toolkit, but we've added more since our launch last month. So as people are pointing out new upcoming implementation of equitable adaptation, we've been adding them. Just as we add them to our clearinghouse, we also add them to the toolkit. So if you guys are working on any amazing projects or policies, then, you know, we're happy to include it if it's a great example of equitable adaptation. Next slide. You can skip this one too as well. So yeah, so basically we hope that you explore the toolkit and let us know what it's most useful for, and how it's useful to your work, and what aspects of this work would benefit from additional support and case studies. We're basically counting on all of the practitioners here in the room to build on and improve this resource and to make it a living document. We welcome your continued support and engagement by sharing your insights and recommendations. And like I said, we've been adding case studies as we get them. So please do share this tool. And if you have any ideas, let us know.
Awesome, Tiffany, thank you so much. Great presentation. We do have a couple questions coming in for you. And I have to apologize. I think we will not have time to dive into a full panel discussion. Perhaps we were overly ambitious with the amount of tools and resources that we wanted to present here today. But that just means that maybe we should do this again. So yes, we will not be doing a full panel discussion after this. We've been trying to address the Q&A and the questions that have been coming through by typing in the answers. So feel free to check those out. And feel free also to email us all afterwards with questions and follow-up. But we do have time. We have like 4 minutes to address a few questions. So I'll maybe take a few questions specifically for Tiffany and then open it up to questions for all of the panelists here. So Tiffany, does the Georgetown Adaptation Clearinghouse tackle the big picture question of the need to stop all harmful extraction and pollution practices to ensure a healthy future for all? And does the adaptation planning include reparations for past and current harm?
So we focus specifically on adaptation measures. So, you know, the impacts are here and here's how we're going to adapt to it. But we do have, on the other side of GCC's house is the mitigation program. So they attack those issues more regularly than we do. And what was the second question? Sorry.
How does the adaptation planning include reparations for past and current harm?
Reparations specifically, I wouldn't say, I would say that each jurisdiction would be different. And the idea of what we do is just collect ideas of what different jurisdictions are doing. And if it works for your community and you speak with your community and that's what they want and that's what they need, then that's what you should be providing. That's the idea of true community engagement, is being held accountable to what the community actually needs and actually wants. Reparations can come in many different forms. There are communities that are giving back to those who have been disenfranchised by, you know, giving them all brand new parks or free, you know, Uber rides to here and there, or, you know, whatever is needed. And I think that would change for every community.
Awesome. Thank you, Tiffany. And I'm going to ask just one more question and open it up to all panelists. We have a question here. How might we elevate tribal voices as part of this process? I think this is absolutely a critical question that we at the state are definitely trying to address, as well as I know other folks across the state. And so anyone who wants to take a stab at this, feel free to jump in.
I would just say, so GCC tends to not dive into tribal processes because we're legal in policy and we don't really know tribal law. But outside of the law, it's really a matter of the procedural equity and engaging that community authentically and using all the guides that are out there to make sure that you're communicating with communities that are actually going to be the ones benefiting or being you know, negatively impacted by these policies and these plans. There are some case studies where like some ideas of like managed retreat, where a tribal community in Washington was able to move their entire community uphill to stop them from being flooded. So there are governments out there that are working directly with these communities in the appropriate way to get things done. And I think the problem is that most are not understanding that that is how you get things done, is by working directly with the community and planning with the community and not kind of considering them after the fact. So I think that's, you know, for every community, not just tribal communities. It's just planning with them to make sure that the outcome is what they were imagining.
Awesome. Alyssa, you can go ahead and move to the next slide, by the way. And the next slide. So here is all of our contact information. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to see if Sona or Kendall, you had any other thoughts on the tribal question just before we wrap up here.
This is, I would, yeah, just, I know it's 11:31, so be mindful of time. I would double click on everything Tiffany said, and just one resource to look into. I know in the 4th climate change assessment, there's a specific report on tribal considerations in the context of adaptation and resilience. So I'd be curious to, yeah, look at that as a starting point. And then I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done to, you know, Tiffany's point, make sure that all of the resilience planning and implementation is really taking community needs into account and is happening alongside communities.
Awesome. Thanks, Sona. All right, I apologize that we were not able to really dig fully into a full discussion and Q&A here, but thank you all so much for joining us. Special thanks to our presenters, Kendall, Sona, and Tiffany, and to Alyssa for helping us manage this webinar. With that, I'd like to wrap it up, but please feel free to reach out to any of us with any questions and follow-up that you might have. Thank you all so much.